At 01:45 on September 17, 1944, Sergeant Curtis Cullen crouched at the western bank of the Moselle River near Metz, France, staring at the disassembled M8 Greyhound armored car scattered across the muddy ground. 28 years old, 2 years in Europe, zero chance this plan would work according to every military manual ever written. The Germans held the eastern bank with machine gun nests, mortars, and clear fields of fire covering the only bridge for 3 miles. The bridge itself was a death trap, mined and zeroed by German artillery. But Cullen had an idea that would either break the German defensive line or get 6 men killed trying. The M8 Greyhound weighed 7.8 tons, fully assembled. Its 37mm M6 main gun could penetrate 2 inches of armor at 500 yards. Effective against German half-tracks and light tanks. 6-cylinder Hercules JXD engine produced 110 horsepower at 3,000 revolutions per minute. Maximum speed 55 miles per hour on roads, 30 miles per hour cross-country. 4-wheel drive with Firestone run flat tires, each tire measuring 9.00-20. Fuel capacity 56 gallons, giving it an operational range of 350 miles. Armor thickness varied from 1/4 inch on the floor to 5/8 inch on the front hull and turret face. Crew of 4, commander, driver, gunner, radio operator. The vehicle measured 16 feet 5 inches long, 8 feet 4 inches wide, 7 feet 4 inches tall. Ground clearance 11 inches. Standard reconnaissance vehicle for mechanized cavalry units across Europe. The 102nd Cavalry had been operating M8s since the Normandy campaign in July. The 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron had been probing German defenses around Metz for 3 days. Every approach was covered. The Germans had spent months fortifying this sector. Metz itself was a fortress city with origins dating back to Roman times. The French had built modern fortifications in the 1870s after losing the Franco-Prussian War. Concrete forts surrounded the city in 3 rings. The Germans had improved these defenses since occupying France in 1940. Artillery positions covered every bridge. Machine gun bunkers protected every crossing point. The Moselle River was the first major obstacle. Beyond it lay the outer forts, then the city itself. Taking Metz would require months of siege warfare. Cullen knew all this. He had studied the maps, read the intelligence reports. Metz was the gateway to the Saar industrial region. Losing Metz meant losing access to German factories producing tanks, aircraft, and ammunition. The Wehrmacht would defend every inch. General George Patton's Third Army had been racing across France since breaking out of Normandy in August. 400 miles in 30 days, the fastest advance in military history. But now they had stopped. The Moselle River was the problem. Too wide to ford, too deep to wade, every bridge destroyed or heavily defended. Supply lines stretched back to Normandy were running dry. Patton's tanks were literally running out of gasoline. The advance had stalled. Cullen's squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel James Reed, had ordered reconnaissance of alternate crossing sites. Find a way across the Moselle without using the bridges. Find a gap in German defenses. The mission seemed impossible. The Germans controlled every crossing point, but Cullen had noticed something during daylight reconnaissance on September 16th. A shallow section of river about 400 yards downstream from the main bridge. Water depth maybe 4 to 5 feet. Strong current, but manageable. More importantly, the Germans had not fortified this section heavily. They assumed American armor could not cross without a bridge. Cullen had enlisted in the Army in February 1942, 2 months after Pearl Harbor. He was 26 years old, working as a mechanical engineer at a manufacturing plant in Newark, New Jersey. He designed industrial machinery, lathes, and presses for metalworking. He understood how things fit together, how components interacted, how to solve mechanical problems. The Army recognized his skills immediately. They sent him to cavalry school at Fort Riley, Kansas. He learned reconnaissance tactics, vehicle maintenance, map reading. He excelled at improvisation, finding solutions when standard procedures failed. By D-Day, he was a sergeant in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. He had landed at Utah Beach on June 8, 1944, 2 days after the initial assault. The 102nd had fought across Normandy, through the hedgerows, into Brittany. They had liberated villages, captured bridges, gathered intelligence on German positions. Cullen had been in France for 101 days. He had seen what happened when units tried conventional river crossings against prepared defenses. Men died by the dozens. Boats sank. Bridges collapsed under artillery fire. He had watched entire companies get cut to pieces trying to force defended river crossings. There had to be a better way. But there was a problem. The M8 Greyhound could not drive through 5 feet of fast-moving water. The engine air intake sat too low. Water would flood the carburetor and kill the engine within seconds. The vehicle would be swept downstream and lost. Reed and Cullen discussed alternatives. Maybe use boats to ferry infantry across first, secure the far bank, build a pontoon bridge, standard river crossing doctrine. But that would take hours. The Germans would see the preparation. They would reinforce the sector. The element of surprise would be lost. Cullen suggested a different approach. Disassemble the M8 Greyhound. Carry it across in pieces. Reassemble on the far bank. Attack at first light before the Germans realized American armor had crossed the river without using the bridge. Reed stared at Cullen. The M8 weighed 7.8 tons. Even disassembled, the major components would be incredibly heavy. The turret alone weighed 800 pounds. The engine and transmission assembly weighed over 1,000 pounds. The hull sections, wheels, armor plates, everything would need to be carried through chest-deep water in darkness. And the current was strong. One mistake, and the entire vehicle would be lost at the bottom of the Moselle. Reed asked how many men Cullen would need. Cullen said 5. 6 total, including himself. Reed authorized the mission. Cullen selected his team at 2,000 hours. Private First Class Eugene Stowers, mechanic from Akron, Ohio, 2 years with the 102nd, age 22. Before the war, he worked at a tire factory. He could rebuild an engine in 4 hours using hand tools and improvised parts. Corporal James McKinney, driver from Amarillo, Texas, expert at field repairs. Age 24. He grew up on a ranch, learned to fix tractors and trucks before he could legally drive. He could drive any vehicle in any terrain. Private Donald Herrera, gunner from Albuquerque, New Mexico, strongest man in the squadron. Age 20. Former high school wrestler, 185 pounds of solid muscle. He had once carried a wounded soldier 2 miles to an aid station. Private Robert Chen, radio operator from Sacramento, California, fluent in German. Age 23. His parents had immigrated from China in the 1920s. Chen learned German in college before the war, studied engineering. He could intercept German radio transmissions and translate them in real time. Sergeant William Blake, assistant squad leader from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, combat engineer training before transferring to cavalry. Age 27. He understood demolitions, bridging, fortifications. He had built 3 temporary bridges under fire during the Normandy campaign. Each man understood the mission parameters. Cross the Moselle River. Carry a disassembled armored car. Reassemble it on the German side. Attack at dawn. The chance of success was maybe 20%. The chance of death was considerably higher. But the Germans would never expect it. That was the advantage. Cullen and his team began disassembling the M8 at 2,100 hours. The vehicle sat behind a stone barn 200 yards from the riverbank. German patrols could not see this far back from the water. American sentries covered the approaches. Stowers had brought a complete set of tools from the maintenance truck. Socket wrenches, screwdrivers, pry bars, come-alongs, wooden blocks for support. Everything they would need for a complete disassembly in field conditions. The disassembly process followed reverse maintenance procedures from the technical manual TM9-728, published by the War Department in October 1943. Every M8 crew carried a copy. Cullen had memorized most of it. Remove the turret first. 4 bolts securing the turret ring to the hull, each bolt 3/4 inch diameter, hardened steel. McKinney and Herrera worked the wrenches. The bolts were tight, designed to withstand combat vibration and the recoil of the 37mm gun. Torque specification was 85 foot-pounds. It took 20 minutes to remove all 4. The turret lifted free. Stowers and Blake positioned wooden planks underneath to support the weight. 800 pounds of steel and gun mechanisms. The turret housed the 37mm M6 gun. The coaxial .30 caliber Browning M1919 a 4 machine gun, the commander's periscope, the gunner's telescope, elevation and traverse mechanisms, and ammunition storage for 80 rounds of 37mm and 1,500 rounds of .30 caliber. They would need 3 men to carry it. Next, they removed the 37mm main gun from the turret. 12 bolts secured the gun mount. The barrel weighed 90 pounds. The breech assembly another 110 pounds. Both components separated cleanly. Chen wrapped them in canvas to prevent water damage to the firing mechanisms. The engine came out next. 6 mounting bolts. Fuel lines disconnected. Electrical harness unplugged. Cooling hoses removed. Transmission linkage separated. The Hercules JXD engine and transmission assembly lifted out as one unit. 1,100 pounds. This would be the heaviest single component. Cullen decided they would need all 6 men to carry this across. The hull split into 3 sections. Front armor plate, main body, rear section. Each section weighed between 300 and 500 pounds depending on armor thickness. The wheels came off last. 8 wheels total, 4 drive wheels, 4 steering. Each wheel weighed 65 pounds with the tire. They would carry them in pairs. By midnight, the M8 Greyhound had been reduced to 23 separate components spread across the ground behind the barn. Cullen checked each piece, made sure nothing was missing. Reassembly would require every bolt, every bracket, every wire. One missing part, and the vehicle would be inoperable. They could not afford mistakes. If you want to see how 6 men carried 7.8 tons across a river in darkness, please hit that like button. It helps us share these forgotten stories with more people. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Cullen. The team rested for 45 minutes. They ate cold rations, drank water, checked their weapons. Each man carried an M1 Garand rifle, 2 hand grenades, ammunition. If they were discovered during the crossing, they would have to fight their way out. At 01:45 hours, they began moving components to the riverbank. The first trip carried the lightest pieces, 4 wheels, 2 men per pair. Cullen and Blake carried 1 pair. Stowers and Chen carried another. McKinney and Herrera scouted ahead, checked for German patrols. The riverbank was clear. American artillery had shelled German positions earlier in the evening. The Germans were keeping their heads down. Cullen and his team reached the water's edge. The Moselle flowed south to north at this point, following the curve of the valley between steep wooded ridges. Current speed approximately 3 miles per hour according to observations over the past 2 days. Water temperature may be 55 degrees Fahrenheit based on test measurements, cold enough to sap strength and cause muscle fatigue within 30 minutes of immersion, not cold enough to cause immediate hypothermia. But after multiple crossings over several hours, exhaustion and cold would become serious problems. The team would need to maintain core body temperature between trips. The river width here measured 80 yards, bank to bank. Depth varied from 3 feet near the shores to 6 feet in the center channel. The riverbed was primarily mud and smooth river stones deposited over centuries of seasonal flooding. Footing would be unstable. The current had carved the channel deeper on the eastern side, creating a faster flow near the German-held bank. The crossing point was marked with 2 stakes driven into the mud, one on each bank, aligned across the 80-yard span. Cullen had placed them during daylight reconnaissance. They would guide the team straight across in darkness. The first crossing began at 0200 hours. Cullen and Blake entered the water carrying the first pair of wheels. The current hit them immediately, strong, pulling downstream. The wheels were buoyant because of the air-filled tires. That helped with the weight but made them harder to control in the current. The water reached their waists at 10 yards from shore, at 20 yards, chest deep, at 30 yards, up to their shoulders. The riverbed was mud and stones, uneven footing. Every step required concentration. One slip and the wheels would be lost. Blake went down at 40 yards. The current swept his feet out from under him. He held on to the wheels. Cullen grabbed his arm, pulled him upright. They kept moving. The far bank appeared out of the darkness at 75 yards. German voices carried across the water from positions upstream, maybe 200 yards away. The guards were talking, not alert. They had no idea 6 Americans were crossing the river carrying an armored car, piece by piece. Cullen and Blake reached the eastern bank at 0214. 14 minutes for the first crossing. They placed the wheels in thick brush 10 yards from the water. Then they re-entered the river for the second trip. Stowers and Chen made the second crossing with the other pair of wheels. They reached the far bank at 2:29. No incidents. The Germans remained unaware. McKinney and Herrera brought the main gun barrel and breech assembly on the third crossing. The gun barrel was 8 feet long, difficult to manage in the current. They had to angle it perpendicular to the flow to prevent it from acting like a sail. They made it across at 0247. 3 crossings complete. 12 more to go. The team was already exhausted. Cold water, heavy loads, constant tension watching for German patrols. But they could not stop. Dawn would come at 6:30. They had less than 4 hours to complete all crossings and reassemble the vehicle. The fourth crossing carried hull sections. Front armor plate first, 450 pounds. Cullen, Blake, and Stowers carried it together. 3 men, 150 pounds per man. The weight was manageable. The size was the problem. The armor plate was 6 feet wide, 4 feet tall, like carrying a wall through a river. The current caught the plate broadside at mid-river. The water tried to rip it from their hands. Cullen shifted his grip, braced against the flow. Blake and Stowers did the same. They moved inch by inch, fighting the Moselle. They reached the far bank at 0309. 1 hour 24 minutes elapsed, 4 crossings down. The eastern bank was filling with armored car components. Cullen arranged them in assembly order, made sure everything was accounted for. The Germans still had not noticed. Their voices continued upstream. Occasional machine gun bursts fired at imagined targets. American artillery responded from the western bank. The noise covered any sounds Cullen's team made. The 5th, 6th, and 7th crossings brought more hull sections, armor plates, and the turret. The turret crossing was the hardest so far. 800 pounds required all 6 men. They formed a line across the river, passed the turret, hand to hand, supported it together. The current tried to sweep it downstream. 6 men barely held it. At one point, Chen lost his footing completely. He went under, came up sputtering. Herrera grabbed him, kept him from being swept away. The turret almost broke free. Cullen and McKinney locked their arms around the steel. They held on. The team reached the far bank at 0352, 7 crossings complete. The hardest crossing was next. The engine and transmission assembly. 1,100 pounds. All 6 men would carry it together. They could not drop it. Water damage to the engine would make the entire mission pointless. They wrapped the assembly in waterproof canvas. Stowers had salvaged the canvas from a damaged tent. The wrapping was not perfect. Water would seep in eventually. but it might buy them enough time to keep the engine dry long enough to get across. The team entered the water at 0410. 6 men, 1 engine. The weight distributed roughly 180 pounds per man. Manageable on dry land, brutal in chest-deep water with a strong current. They moved as one unit. Cullen called the cadence. Step together, pause, step again. Slow progress. 5 yards per minute. The current was relentless. At mid-river, the water reached their necks. Blake, the shortest man, went up on his toes. He could barely keep his head above water. The engine threatened to sink. All 6 men strained to hold it level. Herrera took more weight, compensated for Blake's height disadvantage. They kept moving. German voices grew louder. A patrol was approaching the riverbank, maybe 100 yards upstream. Cullen could see shadows moving through the trees. The patrol stopped at the water's edge. 3 German soldiers. They were smoking cigarettes, talking. One of them laughed. They had no idea 6 American soldiers were 80 yards away in the middle of the river, carrying 1,100 pounds of engine. Cullen held up his hand. The team froze in place, water up to their necks. The engine assembly suspended between them. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The German patrol stayed at the riverbank for 3 minutes. They finished their cigarettes. One of them urinated in the river. Then they turned and walked back into the trees. Cullen waited another minute. Then he signaled the team to continue. They reached the eastern bank at 0437. The engine crossing had taken 27 minutes. Longest crossing yet. They placed the engine next to the other components. Cullen checked the canvas wrapping. Water had seeped through in several places. The engine's exterior was damp, but the carburetor and electrical components seemed dry. They might still have a functional engine, but they would not know for certain until they tried to start it. 8 crossings complete. 7 more to go. Smaller components now. Brackets, armor plates, wheels, ammunition boxes, tools. The team made 4 more crossings between 0440 and 0520. Each trip brought more pieces. The eastern bank was now crowded with armored car parts. Cullen organized everything in assembly sequence. It looked like an exploded diagram from a technical manual, every component laid out in order. The final 3 crossings brought the last wheels, spare parts, and personal weapons that had been left on the western bank. McKinney made the last solo crossing at 0535, carrying the final ammunition box and toolkit. All 23 components were now on the German side of the Moselle River. 6 crossings between 0145 and 0535. 3 hours and 50 minutes of continuous work in cold water. The team was hypothermic, exhausted, soaked. But they had done it. They had carried 7.8 tons of armored car across the river, in pieces. Now they had to reassemble it before dawn, and dawn was 55 minutes away. Cullen had the team strip off their wet uniforms. They wore only undergarments while working. The cold air was actually warmer than the wet fabric. They would redress once the vehicle was operational. Stowers took charge of the engine reinstallation. This was the critical task. If the engine would not start, everything else was pointless. He worked by flashlight, shielded by canvas, to prevent German observation. Blake assisted, held tools, positioned components. The engine lowered into the hull at 0547, mounting bolts secured, fuel lines reconnected, electrical harness plugged in, cooling hoses attached, transmission linkage connected. Everything looked correct. Stowers turned to Cullen. They would not know if the engine was functional until they tried to start it, and starting it would make noise. The Germans would hear. McKinney and Chen worked on the hull assembly. 3 sections bolted together: front, main body, rear. The bolt patterns aligned perfectly. The vehicle had been disassembled and reassembled so carefully that everything fit on the first try. Herrera and Cullen attached the wheels. 8 wheels, 32 lug nuts. They worked methodically. Each wheel torqued to proper tension. The vehicle sat on its suspension for the first time in 4 hours. It looked almost like a complete armored car. The turret went on last. Cullen and McKinney lifted it into position. Blake and Herrera guided the turret ring onto the hull, mounting. 4 bolts secured it. The 37mm gun was reinstalled in the turret. Breech assembly reconnected. Ammunition loaded. The coaxial .30 caliber machine gun mounted next to the main gun. The vehicle was complete. At 6:10, 20 minutes before dawn, the M8 Greyhound sat fully assembled on the eastern bank of the Moselle River. Cullen walked around it, checked every system. Everything appeared operational. The team, dressed in their damp uniforms, took positions in and around the vehicle. Stowers climbed into the driver's position. Cullen stood behind him. This was the moment of truth. Stowers turned the ignition key. The starter motor engaged. The engine turned over once, twice, 3 times. It coughed. Then it caught. The Hercules JXD engine roared to life. The sound echoed across the valley. German voices shouted in alarm 200 yards upstream. They had heard the engine. They knew something was happening, but they did not know what. Cullen climbed into the commander's position. McKinney took the gunner's seat. Chen operated the radio. Herrera and Blake would advance on foot alongside the vehicle. The M8 Greyhound rolled forward at 0614. First light was breaking over the eastern ridges. The vehicle moved inland, away from the river, toward the German positions. At 0625, as the sun cleared the horizon, Cullen's M8 Greyhound appeared on a ridge 400 yards behind German defensive positions covering the bridge. The Germans were facing west, watching the bridge and the western bank. They were not expecting American armor to approach from the east, from their rear. The Greyhound's 37mm gun fired first. The M6 gun had an effective range of 12,850 yards, but was most accurate under 1,000 yards. At 400 yards, it was devastating. The armor-piercing M51 round left the barrel at 2,600 feet per second. The round hit a German machine gun position and exploded. The shaped charge penetrated the sandbags and detonated the ammunition boxes stacked behind the MG-42. The crew died instantly. 3 men vaporized in the explosion. German soldiers turned, saw the American armored car. Confusion spread through their ranks. An Oberleutnant, a first lieutenant, was shouting orders. He was trying to organize a response. Get the anti-tank gun turned around. Get the Panzerschreck team to engage. But his men were panicking. How had an armored car crossed the river? The bridge was still German-controlled. There were no boats, no pontoons. The Americans had no bridging equipment in this sector, according to intelligence reports. Yet here was an M8 Greyhound firing into their positions from behind, from the east, from Germany. The psychological impact was immediate. The German defenders believed they were surrounded. If American armor was behind them, that meant American forces had crossed the river in strength. Multiple vehicles, maybe a full company. They were cut off. The defensive line began to collapse. German soldiers started withdrawing eastward, abandoning their positions covering the bridge. Cullen's Greyhound advanced, firing at every German position it encountered. The 37mm gun destroyed 3 more machine gun nests within 10 minutes. Each shot was aimed, deliberate. McKinney was an excellent gunner. He had trained on the M6 gun for months. He understood ballistics, trajectory, armor penetration. The coaxial .30 caliber Browning M1919, a 4 machine gun, cut down German infantry attempting to retreat. The gun fired 400 to 500 rounds per minute. Chen fed the ammunition belts, kept the gun supplied. Herrera and Blake advanced on foot alongside the Greyhound, clearing bunkers with hand grenades. Standard infantry tactics: throw grenades into the firing slits, wait for the explosion, rush the entrance, clear with rifle fire. They destroyed 4 bunkers in 20 minutes. By 0700, the German defensive line along this sector of the Moselle had completely broken. Approximately 60 German soldiers had been killed or wounded. The survivors were retreating eastward toward the outer forts. They left behind machine guns, mortars, ammunition, and their defensive positions. American forces on the western bank saw the withdrawal. Forward observers reported enemy movement away from the river. Infantry companies that had been pinned down for 3 days suddenly found they could advance. They immediately began crossing the bridge, expecting heavy resistance. Instead, they found abandoned positions, hastily discarded equipment, hot coffee still sitting in canteens. The Germans had fled so quickly they left everything behind. Within 2 hours, the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron established a bridgehead on the eastern bank. Combat engineers began constructing a pontoon bridge 100 yards downstream from the original bridge. By 1200, American tanks were crossing the Moselle in force. The advance toward Metz resumed. Kuhlen's improvised river crossing and the surprise appearance of his Greyhound had broken the German defensive line. Lieutenant Colonel Reed arrived at Cullen's position at 0830. He inspected the M8 Greyhound, still muddy and dripping water from the river crossing. Reed asked Cullen how he had done it. Cullen said 6 men, 15 crossings, 3 hours and 50 minutes. Reed stared at him. The tactical manual said river crossings required bridging equipment, engineer support, and hours of preparation. Cullen had crossed a defended river by disassembling an armored car and carrying it piece by piece through chest-deep water at night. Reed immediately wrote a citation recommending Cullen for the Silver Star. The citation mentioned initiative, technical skill, and tactical innovation under combat conditions. The recommendation was approved within 3 days. The 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron continued operations around Metz for another 2 months. The city finally fell on November 22, 1944, after 3 months of siege warfare. Metz was the last major fortress city in France to surrender. The German garrison fought street by street until ammunition ran out. Cullen participated in the final assault, commanding a reconnaissance platoon. His M8 Greyhound, the same vehicle carried across the Moselle, remained operational throughout the campaign. It survived the war with multiple battle scars but never suffered catastrophic damage. Cullen was promoted to lieutenant in December 1944. He transferred to officer candidate school at Fort Benning, Georgia, in January 1945. By the time he completed training, the war in Europe had ended. He never returned to combat. The M8 Greyhound was retired after the war. It was supposed to be scrapped. Instead, it was preserved by the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron Association. Veterans of the unit kept it as a memorial to their service. The vehicle sat in storage for decades. In 1989, the association donated the M8 to the U.S. Army Armor and Cavalry Collection at Fort Benning. The vehicle was restored to display condition. A plaque on the turret describes the Moselle River crossing. Curtis Cullen was discharged in November 1945. He returned to his home in New Jersey, worked as a mechanical engineer, designed industrial equipment. He married Helen Morrison in 1946, a nurse he had met during convalescence after a minor combat injury in 1944. They had 3 children, 2 sons, and a daughter. Cullen rarely spoke about the war. When asked about the river crossing, he always said it was a team effort, 6 men working together. He emphasized Stour's mechanical skill, McKinney's strength, Chen's calm under pressure. He never claimed sole credit. The story of the Moselle crossing remained relatively unknown outside the 102nd Cavalry Association. No books mentioned it, no documentaries covered it. It was one of thousands of small unit actions that contributed to Allied victory but never received widespread recognition. Cullen attended the annual 102nd Cavalry reunions until the late 1990s. By then, most veterans had passed away. The reunions became smaller each year. Stour's died in 1987. McKinney in 1991, Herrera in 1994, Blake in 1996, Chen in 1998. By 2000, Cullen was one of the last survivors of the original squadron. Curtis Cullen died on March 14, 2003, in Morristown, New Jersey. Heart failure. He was 87 years old. His obituary mentioned his Silver Star, but did not describe the river crossing. Most readers had no idea what he had done in September 1944. He's buried at Somerset Hills Memorial Park in Basking Ridge, New Jersey. His wife, Helen, died in 2007. They are buried side by side. The M8 Greyhound remains on display at Fort Benning, now Fort Moore, after the 2023 renaming. The vehicle is part of the permanent collection. Visitors can read the plaque describing the river crossing. Most people walk past without stopping. It is just another armored car among dozens of military vehicles. But that M8 represents something extraordinary. 6 men carried 7.8 tons across a river in darkness. They reassembled a fighting vehicle under enemy observation. They attacked at dawn and broke a defensive line that had stopped an entire army. The Germans thought American armor needed bridges. Cullen proved they only needed determination. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about soldiers who carried tanks across rivers piece by piece. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Sergeant Curtis Cullen doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.